My name is Aaron Cole, and I've been a fire lookout for the better part of 7 years. I'm not one of those guys who romanticizes the job. I don't write poetry about sunsets or talk about how the forest speaks to me. I took this assignment because it was quiet, predictable, and far away from people. You watch for smoke, you log weather conditions, you maintain the tower, and you go to sleep when the sun goes down. That's how it's supposed to work. The logbook is the most boring part of the job. Pages and pages of wind direction, humidity, cloud cover, lightning strikes beyond the ridge. If you ever read one, you'd think nothing ever happens up here. That's why no one noticed when my entries started changing. Last night, or I guess technically very early this morning, I opened the logbook at 0:07 the way I always do, and I realized I wasn't logging fires anymore. I was logging movement. I didn't set out to do that. Crept in slowly the way bad habits do. A note here about something crossing a service road at night. A scribble there about heat signatures that didn't match known wildlife. I told myself I was just being thorough. After all, the forest is an ecosystem and ecosystems shift. Animals migrate, patterns change. But nothing in my training prepared me for what I started seeing after midnight. From the tower, I can see nearly 60 miles in clear conditions. During the day, it's just trees, ridges, and empty stretches of land that look untouched. At night, it becomes something else. Depth disappears, distances lie, and things move in ways they shouldn't. At 0:19, I recorded the first anomaly of the night. Thermal camera picked up a heat mass moving downslope through the old burn scar to the north. Too tall to be elk. Too steady to be a bear. It didn't rush. It followed the game trail exactly, as if it had used it before. I remember writing that down and feeling faintly embarrassed, like I was wasting ink. At 0:41, I noticed a second heat source, parallel to the first but several hundred meters east. That one stopped periodically, lingering near stands of dead timber. I adjusted the zoom and watched it crouch. Not sit, not lie down, but compress itself closer to the ground, reducing its heat signature before moving again. That was when the idea hit me, not as fear but as clarity. These weren't random sightings. They were routes. I've spent years watching animals migrate through this region. Deer follow predictable corridors. Predators follow prey. Even scavengers time their movements around weather and moonlight. What I was seeing fit into that same logic, just expanded, as if there were entire categories of life moving through the forest that weren't on any chart. I started cross-referencing old entries. Not just mine, but archived logs scanned into the system decades ago. Whenever something strange was dismissed, unidentified tracks, unexplained carcasses, missing livestock, it lined up with specific terrain features, boreal zones, river confluences, abandoned infrastructure, places where ecosystems overlapped or broke down. At 1:12, the cameras near the southern ravine triggered. Night vision caught movement near the collapsed bridge that's been out D for years. I've always hated that spot. Even animals usually avoid it. But there it was, wings or something like wings, unfurling briefly before folding back in tight. It moved along the bridge supports like it knew every bolt and shadow. I didn't write creature or entity in the logbook. I wrote, utilizes liminal structure for travel and concealment. That phrasing matters. It's the difference between superstition and ecology. By 2 o'clock, I wasn't just watching. I was cataloging. I noted how one shape avoided moonlight while another seemed to prefer it. How some heat signatures clustered near water sources while others hugged dry, rocky ground. There was order to it. Roles, niches. One entry still makes my stomach tighten when I read it back. 237 large mass moving through northern tree line. Heat output consistent with muscle-dense organism. Path intersects elk migration route. Observed deviation in local wildlife behavior approximately 15 minutes prior. Possible apex predation event pending. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was harmless observation. Because if these things had niches, then they had prey. And if they had prey, then the forest wasn't just hosting them. It was supporting them. Around 3:15, the radio crackled. No incoming transmission, just a burst of static that coincided perfectly with a spike in movement across 3 camera zones. I felt watched then, not in the horror movie sense, but the way animals sense pressure in the environment before a storm. I stepped outside onto the catwalk. The forest below was dark, but not empty. I could feel motion like currents beneath the surface of water. Paths I couldn't see but somehow understood were there. That's when I realized something worse. These movements weren't new. They'd been happening for as long as the forest existed. Longer, maybe. The only difference now was that human activity, roads, towers, tunnels, landfills, had created new corridors, new feeding opportunities, new adaptations. At 4:02, I wrote a line I never intended anyone else to read. Human presence acting as ecological pressure. Observed adaptive behavior suggests long-term coexistence, not emergence. The sun was still hours away. The logbook was nearly full, and whatever was migrating through my sector that night hadn't finished yet. I knew that with absolute certainty, the way prey animals know when the hunt isn't over. I kept writing anyway, because once you understand that you're not witnessing isolated horrors, but an entire living system operating just out of sight, you don't look away. You document, and you hope the tower is still high enough to keep you out of the food chain. By the time the eastern sky started to thin from black to dark blue, I had already filled 3 more pages of the logbook. My handwriting had changed. It slanted harder, tighter, like I was trying to pin the words down before they escaped me. I didn't feel tired. That was the part that scared me most. After an all-night watch, exhaustion usually hits like a wall. Instead, my mind felt sharpened, alert in a way that bordered on predatory. At 5:11, movement patterns shifted. The northern routes went quiet almost all at once. Thermal signatures that had been pacing the ridgelines simply stopped. Not faded, not retreated. They vanished, as if something upstream in the system had changed and the migration no longer required them to move. Then the southern zones lit up. The abandoned service road below the tower, the one swallowed by brush and rot, showed traffic again. Multiple heat sources this time, moving in staggered intervals. They weren't traveling together, but they weren't random either. Each one maintained distance from the others, spacing themselves like animals competing for the same corridor without wanting to provoke conflict. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just migration. It was resource partitioning. I flipped back through older footage, scrubbing through weeks of recordings I'd never bothered to examine closely. Every so-called cryptid sighting followed the same invisible logic. Certain forms only appeared near water treatment runoff, others near mineral-rich outcrops. One recurring silhouette favored landfills on the park's outskirts, moving through drainage culverts and storm tunnels like veins beneath the earth. I had written them off as anomalies before. Now I saw the pattern. They weren't haunting those places. They were feeding. At 6:03, daylight finally broke over the treeline. Normally, that's when the forest relaxes. Nocturnal predators retreat. Birds reclaim the air. But this morning felt wrong. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that happens after something large has passed through. I stepped outside again, binoculars in hand. The ground below the tower showed signs I hadn't noticed before. Game trails pressed deeper into the soil than usual. Scrapes on trees that didn't match bear or elk. Patches of vegetation flattened in elongated shapes, like something had dragged itself low to avoid skyline exposure. I logged it all. Habit. compulsion, fear. At 7:18, the radio crackled again, this time resolving into a voice. My own call sign echoed back at me, distorted, delayed by several seconds. I hadn't transmitted anything. I cut the volume immediately. Sound carries information. Whatever was moving through the forest didn't need more of mine. As the morning wore on, signs of disruption appeared everywhere. A herd of deer broke cover at the wrong hour, sprinting downslope without direction. Ravens clustered above one section of forest and refused to leave, circling as if anchored to something below. Even the insects behaved strangely, abandoning shaded areas to swarm in exposed clearings. Predator-prey dynamics collapsing under pressure. I thought about climate reports I'd skimmed and ignored. Warmer winters, shorter freeze cycles, human development carving corridors through what used to be sealed habitats. If these things had survived by occupying narrow ecological niches for centuries, then we were forcing them to adapt at a pace they'd never needed before. Adapt or starve. At 9:42, the cameras near the old drainage tunnel triggered motion alerts so rapid they overlapped. The tunnel connects to nothing useful anymore. Just a forgotten artery beneath a decommissioned road. I zoomed in and felt my throat tighten. Something was waiting there. It wasn't moving. It didn't need to. Smaller heat signatures approached, paused, then retreated. One didn't make it back. The tunnel swallowed its heat entirely, like a mouth closing. I wrote, observed interspecies predation. Hierarchical niche dominance confirmed. I stopped pretending this was academic after that. The sun climbed higher, but the sense of pressure didn't lift. Instead, it shifted inward, toward the tower itself. I started noticing paths that pointed directly at me. Not literal trails, lines of movement that converged, tested, then peeled away, as if the tower was a landmark in their world now. At 12:06, I ate for the first time that day and barely tasted it. My eyes kept flicking to the treeline, to the shadowed gaps between trunks where depth collapsed into black. I remembered something from an old ranger briefing, half joking at the time. If wildlife starts using your infrastructure more than you do, the instructor had said, it's time to ask why. By early afternoon, I had my answer. Human structures weren't intrusions anymore. They were extensions of the ecosystem. Elevated platforms, warm metal surfaces, waste byproducts, predictable schedules. We'd become a reliable resource, and that made us dangerous prey. At 15:30, I logged the first instance of deliberate observation. One heat signature stopped at the edge of the clearing and oriented itself upward. It stayed there for almost 4 minutes, perfectly still, facing the tower. Not hunting, not traveling, assessing. I lowered the binoculars slowly. The forest felt closer than it had that morning, like it was leaning in. I thought about reporting everything, dumping the footage, calling it in as mass equipment failure or wildlife emergency. But I knew what would happen. They'd send someone, a biologist, a cleanup crew, people who would walk into a system they didn't know existed, carrying assumptions that would get them killed. At 17:02, I wrote the line that changed everything. Information containment may be the only remaining barrier between stable coexistence and open conflict. As the light began to fade again, movement resumed across the lower elevations. The second wave, adjusted routes, new timings, the ecosystem responding in real time, and the worst realization of all settled in my gut. They weren't just adapting to the land anymore. They were adapting to us. I stayed at the desk as the sun dipped below the horizon, pen hovering over the page, knowing the night cycle was about to begin again. Whatever migrated after dark had learned something new from the day. So had I, and neither of us was going to forget it. Night returned faster than it should have. The sun dropped behind the ridgeline at 1847, but the forest didn't ease into darkness, collapsed into it. One moment I could still separate trees from shadow, the next everything fused into a single breathing mass below the tower. The transition felt artificial, like the environment had reached a threshold and decided to move on without waiting for me. I turned every camera back on. At 1902, motion alerts stacked on top of each other so quickly the system lagged. Heat signatures bloomed across the lower elevations, closer than anything I'd logged the night before. They weren't drifting through anymore. They were repositioning. Routes overlapped, then diverged, not chaotically but with intent, like a system optimizing itself under new constraints. I felt it then, the moment observation ended. The tower was no longer separate from what was happening below. It had been studied all day. Its height, its heat, its rhythm. Now it was being accounted for. At 1931, I heard something that didn't belong to wind or wildlife. A low, resonant knock traveled up through the steel supports beneath the cabin. Not loud, not violent, just enough to register as deliberate. I waited, counting breaths, hoping it was thermal contraction. Then it came again, higher this time, closer to the floorboards. Animals don't test structures like that. They push, they scrape, they claw. This felt like something checking load-bearing integrity. I wrote it down anyway. 1934, audible contact with tower infrastructure. Pattern suggests exploratory interaction rather than displacement behavior. Even as the pen moved, I knew the wording was defensive. Academic language as insulation. Movement intensified at the tower's base. Several heat signatures entered the clearing, then peeled away, circling just beyond the light spill. None approached directly. They traced arcs, maintaining distance, like surveyors mapping blind spots. I realized they were doing to me exactly what I'd been doing to them. At 20:06, the radio activated on its own. No static, no call sign, just breathing, slow, uneven, close enough that I could hear the faint hitch between inhales, like lungs working against unfamiliar gravity. I didn't touch the controls. I didn't speak. Sound carries information, and whatever was listening didn't need more of mine. After 47 seconds, the channel went dead. I logged it with shaking hands, noting duration, audio profile, proximity. The act of writing kept panic from forming shape. By 2100 hours, the forest felt crowded. Not visually, emotionally. The cameras showed movement everywhere, but never density. Balance was being maintained. Efficiency. No wasted energy. This wasn't chaos. This was an ecosystem at peak operation. At 2142, something climbed. Not the stairs. The vibration came up through the supports in a slow, steady rhythm, stopping just short of the cabin floor. Whatever was ascending didn't rush. It adjusted grip, redistributed weight, learned as it moved. I didn't look out the window. Direct eye contact establishes hierarchy. Even humans know that. Instead, I stared at the logbook and wrote what mattered. Vertical access achieved. Elevated human structures no longer function as isolation barriers. The implications settled in deeper than fear. If the tower was accessible, then so was every lookout, every platform, every shelter we'd ever assumed was safe by virtue of height alone. We hadn't built above the ecosystem. We'd built inside it. At 2218, the knocking came from the door. 3 taps, evenly spaced, not forceful, patient. The handle shifted once, gently, like something testing resistance rather than attempting entry. Outside, a heat signature flared white on the monitor, close enough that the sensor struggled to resolve edges. I thought about disclosure then, about proof. about what happens when you expose a functioning system to mass attention before understanding its stabilizers. Removing keystone species doesn't just collapse ecosystems. Introducing knowledge at the wrong scale does the same thing. At 2231, the pressure shifted. The roof creaked. Something had climbed higher than expected, exploiting angles I hadn't considered. I imagined it pressed flat against the metal above me, feeling residual warmth through layers of insulation, mapping my position by temperature alone. I stopped writing, not because I was afraid, but because I understood the final rule of observation. When a system becomes aware of being studied, it responds. At 2304, everything stopped. No movement, no sound. The forest went dead in a way I had never experienced. Even the wind suspended itself, as if waiting for instruction. I didn't move. Minutes passed without sensation. The cameras showed nothing. The tower felt hollow, like a shell that had already been evaluated and set aside. At 2317, a single heat signature appeared at the edge of the clearing. It didn't advance. It didn't retreat. It oriented itself toward the tower and remained there, motionless. Not hunting, not probing, observing. That was when I understood the migration hadn't been about food or territory anymore. It was recalibration, a system adjusting to a variable that could no longer be ignored. Humanity wasn't outside the ecosystem. We were a disturbance within it. At 2358, the heat signature withdrew into the trees. Others followed. Routes rewrote themselves in real time, patterns shifting with quiet efficiency. By midnight, the forest was still again. I remained in the tower until dawn, hands locked together, logbook closed. When rescue crews arrived later that morning, they said I'd logged unusual wildlife activity and recommended evaluation. They copied the footage, most of it corrupted during transfer. Thermal artifacts, sensor faults, inconclusive data. The logbook vanished sometime after. I'm reconstructing it from memory now, because memory is the only place it still exists. Maybe that's intentional, because if these things truly occupy ecological niches, if they migrate, adapt, and compete like any other species, then secrecy isn't their defense mechanism. We are. We change the world faster than they ever could. We carve new corridors, generate new waste streams, alter climates, and call it progress. And sooner or later, every system responds to pressure. Next time, they won't knock. Morning didn't feel like relief. It felt like an administrative phase. Light returned to the forest in thin layers, revealing trees exactly where they were supposed to be, shadows behaving again, birds tentatively resuming sound like they were waiting for permission. If I hadn't watched the night happen, I might have believed nothing had changed. But the tower felt wrong. Not damaged, not violated, just finalized, like a place that had served its purpose. The first radio call came at 6:42. Routine check-in from district operations, asking why my overnight logs flagged so many sensor anomalies. The voice was calm, professional, uninterested in context. I answered with rehearsed neutrality, using language I knew would translate well into paperwork. Equipment malfunction, weather interference, wildlife overlap, words that close doors. By 7:30, a helicopter passed overhead, lower than necessary. It didn't circle. It didn't search. It traced a straight line from the south, hovered briefly above the clearing, then moved on. Not rescue, reconnaissance. I opened the logbook again for the first time since midnight. The page was blank, not torn out, not smudged, just empty, as if the ink had never been there. I flipped backward. Same thing. Page after page wiped clean, except for the most mundane entries: wind speed, temperature, cloud cover. Anything observational beyond baseline reality had been selectively erased. I felt a hollow satisfaction at that. Confirmation that what I'd seen mattered enough to be removed. At 9:14, Boots on Gravel announced company. 2 people approached the tower on foot, their movement efficient, confident. Not rangers. No one assigned to this sector walks that way unless they already know the terrain too well. They didn't ask to come up. They waited. When I opened the door, they didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. They carried tablets instead of notebooks, their screens already populated with maps, heat overlays, migration routes I recognized immediately. "You logged a deviation," one of them said. Not a question. I nodded. "Night cycle escalation," the other added, scrolling. "Vertical access. Infrastructure assessment." I nodded again. They didn't accuse. They didn't reassure. They observed me the way the forest had, carefully, without emotional investment. "We're consolidating lookout data," the first said. "Your tower sits on a convergence zone. Multiple niche overlaps." It was inevitable. I almost laughed at that. Inevitable is what people say when they don't want responsibility attached. They asked about sounds, about the radio, about the knock. I answered honestly, and neither of them reacted. No surprise, no skepticism, just quiet confirmation that my experience fit within existing models. "We don't call them sightings," the second one said. "We call them pressures." That word stuck with me. They explained in fragments what I already suspected, that these organisms, whatever name people give them, had always existed within narrow ecological roles. Cold-adapted predators tracking large ungulates. Liminal scavengers exploiting transitional spaces. Subterranean specialists feeding on mineral runoff and waste. Systems nested inside systems, invisible because they rarely intersected with us. Until now, human development had done more than expose them. It had subsidized them. Roads created corridors. Landfills created predictable food sources. Climate instability blurred seasonal boundaries they'd evolved around. We'd widened their niches and forced competition where none had existed before. Migration wasn't an anomaly. It was a response. At 11:26, they asked for the footage. I told them it was corrupted. They smiled, just slightly. They already knew. By early afternoon, the tower was no longer mine. Sensors were removed. Cameras replaced with models I didn't recognize. Frequencies changed. Access protocols rewritten. The place was still called a fire lookout, but that was camouflage now. A label to keep hikers calm and funding streams clean. Before they left, one of them paused at the door. "You did the right thing by writing it down," he said. "Even if it didn't survive. Does it ever stop?" I asked. He considered that. "No," he said, "but it stabilizes. Usually." At 15:02, I was escorted down the mountain. From the trail, the tower looked smaller than it ever had. Less dominant. Just another structure absorbed into the landscape. I wondered how many others like it already existed, quiet nodes in a network of observation designed not to expose, but to delay. Delay buys time. Time buys control. That night, from a temporary quarters miles away, I watched the tree line with naked eyes. Nothing moved that I could see. No shapes, no silhouettes, no knocks, but I felt the pressure again. Subtle, patient. I realized then that the real threat wasn't discovery. It was normalization. Once a system adapts to you, it stops announcing itself. It stops testing. It simply incorporates you the way forests incorporate fallen trees. Slowly, efficiently, without malice. They told me not to keep writing. They didn't have to insist. But this part matters. Because what migrated through my sector didn't retreat. It redistributed. It learned which human structures were monitored, which ones were ignored, which ones produced heat, waste, sound, predictability. And it adjusted accordingly. The journal didn't end that night. It went dark. And whatever comes next won't announce itself with footsteps or radio static. It will arrive the way all successful adaptations do, quietly. The temporary quarters were supposed to feel safer. Concrete walls, backup power, radios that worked only one way. The kind of place designed to make people believe distance equals protection. Didn't. Night fell again, slower this time, like the world was being careful not to draw attention to itself. From the window, I could see the edge of the forest where the floodlights stopped. Past that line, darkness wasn't empty. It was organized. At 1821, the lights flickered. Just once. Barely enough to notice. The generator didn't stutter. Power readings stayed stable. Whatever caused it hadn't touched the infrastructure directly. Pressure without contact. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened. Not for sounds, there weren't any, but for absence. The forest had learned that noise-triggered response. Silence was more efficient. That realization landed heavy. At 1847, my phone vibrated. No signal. No incoming call. Just the device waking itself, screen glowing faintly before going dark again. I powered it off and placed it face down on the floor. The room felt smaller after that. I thought about what the men from the tower had said. About stabilization. About delay. About how systems don't need to eliminate variables if they can integrate them. At 1912, the radio on the desk activated. Different frequency. Not the one assigned to the quarters. The display didn't show a channel, just a blank field where numbers should have been. I didn't touch it. A tone pulsed through the speaker, low and rhythmic. Not a signal. A marker. Something announcing presence without invitation. I realized then that the migration wasn't confined to forests or mountains. Those were just the original niches. Human environments offered better ones. Predictable heat, consistent waste, rigid schedules. We had become an extension of the terrain. At 1940, movement registered outside the perimeter lights. Not on cameras. On me. That instinctual tightening in the chest that animals get before they bolt. I stepped closer to the window and immediately regretted it. Something moved just beyond the light's reach, not crossing the boundary, not retreating either. Testing thresholds. I stayed still. Minutes passed. The thing, whatever it was, didn't rush. It adjusted its position incrementally, learning how far illumination extended, how shadows pooled against concrete, how long it took for my breathing to change when I noticed it. This wasn't a hunt. It was calibration. At 2023, the radio tones stopped. Silence returned, thicker than before. I slept in fragments, dreams punctured by half-awareness, by the certainty that something outside was awake when I wasn't. At 22:01, I woke to the sensation of weight settling near the building. Not impact, presence. No footsteps, no scraping, just mass. I didn't check the window. I didn't reach for the light. I understood now that response was data. Reaction refined the model. At 23:16, a sound traveled through the walls. Not a knock, not a tap. A low-frequency vibration that hummed through the structure like distant machinery. It lasted long enough to register, short enough to remain ambiguous. When it stopped, the building felt accepted, as if it had passed inspection. Sometime near midnight, the pressure eased. Not vanished, relocated. I sensed movement shifting away, dispersing into the surrounding terrain with purpose. The night cycle had completed. Morning came at 6:03 with administrative efficiency again. A vehicle arrived. No sirens, no insignia, I was told my assignment was concluded. Indefinite leave. Mandatory silence agreement framed as concern for my well-being. They asked if I'd noticed anything unusual overnight. I said no. That was the first lie that felt like survival instead of denial. As they drove me farther from the forest, I watched the tree line recede in the mirror. Nothing chased us. Nothing followed. Why would it? Migration doesn't pursue what it has already mapped. At 10:44, we passed an industrial park on the outskirts of town. Heat shimmered off rooftops. Waste compactors cycled predictably. Drainage systems hummed beneath the pavement. I felt it then. That same pressure. Fainter, broader, distributed. That was the moment the full implication landed. The ecosystem hadn't expanded toward us. We had expanded into it. By the time we reached the city, I understood what stabilization meant. Not containment, not eradication, diffusion, spread thin enough to avoid notice, adaptation quiet enough to be mistaken for coincidence. The system didn't need forests anymore. It needed patterns, and humans are nothing if not patterned. I'm writing this now because writing is the only way to mark territory that isn't physical. The only way to leave a trace that doesn't produce heat or sound or waste. They told me the journal was gone. They were wrong. It just migrated. And wherever this ends up being read, understand this. What shocked me wasn't what I saw moving at night. It was realizing that migration never stops. It only changes routes. The city was louder than the forest, but it was a controlled noise. Traffic followed signals. People followed schedules. Even chaos arrived on time. That predictability used to feel safe. By late afternoon, I had been relocated twice. Temporary housing, then a short-term observation unit that looked like a repurposed office building. White walls, tinted windows, air vents that hummed at a frequency just low enough to fade into the background. I was told it was precautionary, standard protocol. Pressure doesn't vanish when scenery changes. It just redistributes. At 16:38, I noticed the first inconsistency. A group of pigeons lifted from the sidewalk all at once, not startled upward but outward, clearing space around a single storm drain. They didn't scatter. They formed a rough circle in the air, refusing to cross back over the same point. No one else reacted. At 16:52, a sanitation truck stalled at the intersection below my window. The engine kept running. The compactor cycled once without being engaged. The driver sat still for nearly 2 minutes before restarting the route, hands shaking when he pulled away. I wrote nothing down. Habit was trying to resurface, and I had to fight it. Observation creates patterns. Patterns attract attention. At 17:11, the building's security feed glitched. Just one camera. The one pointed at the underground parking ramp. The image smeared, then stabilized, showing nothing unusual. No movement flagged. No alert triggered. But I knew what I was looking for now. Negative space. At 17:29, someone screamed. It was short, sharp, cut off too quickly to be theatrical. The sound came from street level, echoing up the concrete corridor between buildings. By the time anyone reacted, it was over. People clustered. Phones came out. Someone laughed nervously. Urban behavior absorbing anomaly. An ambulance arrived. No police. The report said, medical episode. Heat exhaustion. Panic attack. The words were chosen carefully, the way people choose words when they don't want follow-up questions. At 18:04, the pressure returned. Not focused, not directional, just present like a system waking up and stretching into available space. I felt it in my teeth, in the way my shoulders refused to relax. I understood then that the city offered better niches than the forest ever had. basements, subways, utility corridors, waste streams rich with byproducts no natural ecosystem could generate on its own. We'd built a parallel underworld and filled it with resources. Of course, something adapted to it. At 1837, a text message appeared on my phone. No sender, no number, just 4 words. Are you still logging? I deleted it immediately, powered the phone off, set it in the sink and turned the tap on until the screen went dark for good. At 1851, the building across the street lost power. Only 1 floor, the rest remained lit. Office workers leaned out windows, annoyed, joking about outages. The darkened floor stayed dark for exactly 13 minutes before lights snapped back on all at once. No one noticed the silhouettes that didn't belong to people during that interval. I did. They weren't clear, not defined enough to describe, but they moved with purpose, hugging walls, favoring corners, avoiding reflective surfaces. Learning. At 1920, an alert went out internally. Localized infrastructure irregularities. No instructions. No evacuation. Just awareness without context. That's how panic is managed. You keep it vague enough to stay theoretical. I stopped pretending this was containment. This was expansion. At 1947, a woman knocked on my door. I hadn't heard her approach. No footsteps. No elevator chime. Just 3 taps, evenly spaced, identical to the ones at the tower. I didn't answer. She knocked again. Same rhythm. Maintenance, she called. Her voice sounded right. Neutral. Tired. Human. I stayed still. After a full minute, the doorknob turned slightly, then released. No attempt to force entry. No escalation. Just confirmation. When she left, the pressure shifted, flowing down the hallway like water finding a lower channel. At 2033, news feeds lit up with reports of isolated incidents. A man found unconscious near a subway vent. Animals behaving erratically in an industrial zone. A garbage collector hospitalized after claiming something was moving under the bags. The language was consistent. No pattern acknowledged. At 2110, I understood the mistake. They hadn't brought me here to protect me. They'd brought me here because I was already part of the dataset. Whatever was adapting had encountered me in one environment and was now testing how I functioned in another. Tracking continuity. Verifying identity across contexts. That's what real predators do. They don't chase. They confirm. At 2158, the building settled. Pipes shifted. Elevators paused between floors, then resumed as if nothing had happened. The pressure peaked, then stabilized. The system had finished mapping this node. Near midnight, I finally slept. Not because it was safe, but because resistance had become irrelevant. I woke at 5:12 to sirens in the distance. Controlled response. Narrow radius. Another isolated incident. By morning, the city looked the same as it always had. People went to work. Trash was collected. Lights followed schedules. Migration doesn't announce itself in urban environments. It blends. The last thing I remember writing before I stopped entirely was this. Forests taught them how to survive. Cities are teaching them how to hide. And once something learns that, you don't notice it until the space around you feels just a little too organized. The first fatality wasn't announced. It leaked. I learned about it at 7:26, not from an alert or briefing, but from a local news crawl that vanished after less than a minute. Unidentified cause of death under investigation. It read, paired with a blurred photo of a subway entrance I recognized immediately. It was one of the older stations. Deeper than necessary, poorly ventilated, surrounded by maintenance tunnels that didn't appear on public maps. Perfect niche. By 8:03, the story was gone. replaced by a traffic update, then a weather warning. Normal noise smothering abnormal signal. I wasn't supposed to see any of that. The observation unit's network was filtered, curated. Someone had made a mistake, or someone had wanted me to see it. At 8:41, I was escorted to a different floor. Fewer windows, thicker doors. The explanation was logistical efficiency. The truth was simpler. Containment had failed. They didn't call it that, of course. In the room where they finally sat me down, the word used was escalation. Controlled, clinical, as if escalation were something you could schedule. A man I hadn't seen before spoke without notes. Last night, we recorded a deviation from predicted interaction models. That was how he described a human death. He didn't say how the person died. He didn't need to. The silence around the detail was confirmation enough. Whatever had adapted to forests, then infrastructure, then cities had crossed the last boundary. Consumption. At 9:12, they showed me a still frame pulled from corrupted footage. Most of the image was noise, compression artifacts, thermal bleed, but the negative space was unmistakable. Something had been there, something that understood where cameras failed. This wasn't predatory, the man said. Not in the traditional sense. I waited. It was corrective. That word stayed with me. Corrective implies response to error, adjustment, removal of a destabilizing element. I asked what the victim had been doing. They hesitated, then answered. Maintenance, overnight inspection, alone, routine. Patterns invite calibration. By mid-morning, suppression protocols were fully active. Transit delays attributed to power maintenance. Animal control alerts issued without context. Social media throttled around specific keywords, replaced with trending distractions engineered to pull attention elsewhere. The city didn't panic. It adapted. At 11:37, a second incident almost happened. Almost. A construction site supervisor reported movement beneath a temporary housing unit. Not rodents, not collapse. Something pacing beneath the structure testing supports. The crew was evacuated under the pretense of a gas leak. When inspectors arrived, the space was empty, but the ground had settled differently, as if weight had been redistributed elsewhere. I was moved again at 12:20. This time there was no explanation, just motion, elevators, corridors, doors that opened before I reached them. I noticed the building's layout had changed, not physically but procedurally. Routes that used to be accessible were now sealed. Others were opened, creating new paths through the structure. Human infrastructure responding like an organism under stress. 13:05, someone asked me a question no one had asked before. Did it acknowledge you? I didn't answer immediately. Yes, I said finally. No one reacted. That told me everything. At 14:18, the second death was confirmed internally. This one didn't happen underground. It happened in a high-rise, upper floors, climate-controlled, secure access. The victim had been alone for less than 10 minutes. The footage was cleaner this time. Still incomplete, but enough to see the moment the environment changed. Light bent oddly near the ceiling. Sound dropped out like the room had been wrapped in insulation. Then movement, fast, efficient, uninterested in resistance. Not hunting, executing. The language in the report avoided verbs as much as possible. At 14:09, subject ceased biological activity. No struggle noted. No signs of forced entry. The room had passed inspection. At 1500 hours, I realized suppression wasn't about hiding the creatures anymore. It was about hiding the pattern. 2 deaths don't make a trend. 3 begin to. At 1544, something changed. Pressure spiked across the building, sharp enough that several people stopped mid-sentence, hands lifting instinctively to their heads. It passed in seconds, leaving behind disorientation and headaches that would later be blamed on HVAC issues. I recognized it for what it was: communication, not with us, with itself. Systems don't centralize when they're threatened. They decentralize. Redundancy replaces hierarchy. Nodes become interchangeable. At 1630, the decision was made. I wasn't told directly. I inferred it from the way people stopped making eye contact, from the way my access was reduced, then quietly restored in unexpected places. They weren't deciding whether to remove the threat. They were deciding how much loss was acceptable. At 1712, the man from the tower appeared again, standing too close, voice low. We're reaching the point where observation may no longer be ethical. I almost laughed. This was never ethical, I said. It was just invisible. He didn't argue. Instead, he said something worse. They're not targeting randomly anymore. I waited. They're targeting efficiently. At 1800 hours, the city shifted again. Transit reroutes, building closures, soft curfews framed as safety advisories. The public complied, grateful for guidance, unaware they were being gently herded away from newly claimed niches. At 1847, the time stuck in my head for obvious reasons. I felt it again. That patient attention, not directed at the building, at me. I understood then why I'd been kept alive, why I'd been moved instead of dismissed, why questions kept circling back to acknowledgement. I wasn't just a witness, I was a reference point. At 1922, a final internal message circulated. Escalation confirmed, suppression ongoing, public disclosure not advised. Translation: this continues. By nightfall, the city had quieted in unnatural ways. Fewer cars, fewer voices, gaps where life usually pressed close together. Gaps are opportunities. I stopped trying to sleep. I stopped trying to rationalize. I accepted the final truth the forest had taught me. When an ecosystem identifies a destabilizing species, it doesn't wage war. Corrects. And correction doesn't need permission. By the time night returned, the city no longer pretended to be normal. Lights were still on, traffic still moved, people still followed instructions, but the rhythm was wrong. Too cautious, too synchronized, like a body holding itself still to avoid pain. At 1941, all external observation feeds were cut, not offline, redirected. Screens in the operations center showed static loops of earlier footage, daylight scenes replayed on delay. Anyone glancing at them would assume nothing new was happening. Nothing visible ever does right before collapse. The pressure that followed wasn't localized anymore. It wasn't attached to buildings or streets or infrastructure. It was ambient, a low, omnipresent awareness pressing inward from every direction, like gravity had subtly increased. I felt it in my balance, in the way my thoughts refused to wander. At 2003, a new protocol went into effect. I wasn't told directly. No briefing, no explanation. Instead, doors that used to lock no longer did. Routes that had been restricted opened without request. Elevators responded before buttons were pressed. Containment had shifted focus. They weren't protecting me anymore. They were offering me. At 2027, the first zone went dark. Not a blackout, a silence. Streetlights remained on, but motion vanished. Vehicles stalled where they were, engines idling, doors open. People froze mid-movement, not panicked, not unconscious. Paused. Whatever had adapted no longer needed stealth. It needed compliance. I realized then that the early encounters, the knocks, the breathing, the testing, hadn't been threats. They'd been questions. At 2054, I was alone in a corridor that hadn't existed an hour earlier. Same building, same floor, different geometry, turns where there shouldn't have been turns. Ceiling panels rearranged subtly, guiding movement without force. Environmental shaping. Predators don't always chase. Sometimes they redesign the landscape so escape becomes inefficient. At 2111, the first internal alarm sounded. It wasn't evacuation. It was acknowledgement. A single tone pulsed through the building, deep enough to vibrate bone. It lasted 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to feel it, short enough to avoid panic. When it ended, the pressure eased slightly. That terrified me more than escalation. It meant the system was satisfied. At 2136, a message appeared on a terminal I hadn't touched. No further adjustments required. Reference confirmed. I understood then why the city hadn't collapsed into chaos. Chaos wastes energy. Correction is precise. At 2202, movement resumed, not everywhere, just enough. People were released from their pause states gradually, confused but functional. Incidents would later be described as brownouts, gas exposure, stress responses. The pattern held. Remove variables. Restore baseline. Advance. At 2219, I felt it again. That attention. Focused. Personal. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't curious. It was final. I stopped moving. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to do something human and loud. But I knew better now. Motion would only refine the model. Instead, I stood still and waited. At 2231, the air changed. Not temperature, density. Sound dampened, like the corridor had been wrapped in insulation. My own breathing sounded distant, delayed, as if it had to travel farther to reach my ears. The lights didn't flicker. They bent. Edges softened. Shadows pooled where they shouldn't, overlapping like layers of bad alignment. Something moved through that distortion, not stepping into the space but redefining it. It didn't appear. It resolved. I understood then why cameras failed, why footage corrupted, why description always fell short. It wasn't invisible. It was incompatible. The system had reached the final stage of adaptation. Direct interface. I don't remember pain. I remember evaluation, weight distribution, thermal output, neural response, recognition markers. It wasn't invasive. It was efficient. And then acknowledgement, not speech, not images, understanding. I was no longer anomalous. I was classified. At 2244, the pressure lifted. Sound returned. Geometry stabilized. The corridor was just a corridor again. I was alone. Alive. That was worse. At 2310, suppression officially ended. The language used was transition complete. They didn't try to hide anything after that. There was no need. The system had finished integrating. The city resumed its rhythm, slower, tighter, subtly altered. Routes changed. Behaviors shifted. Certain spaces emptied permanently, not through force, but through instinct. People avoided places they couldn't explain. That's how niches are claimed. I left the building before midnight. No one stopped me. No one followed. Why would they? Migration doesn't escort what it has already absorbed. The last thing I felt before the night settled was certainty. This wasn't an invasion. It was succession. And we were no longer at the top of the system. Morning arrived without announcement. No sirens. No emergency broadcasts. No sudden understanding spreading through the population. Just light sliding across buildings that had already adjusted to it. The city woke the way it always had, except fewer people chose to be outside, and no one could quite explain why. I walked. No destination. No urgency. Movement for its own sake felt unnecessary now, but still allowed. The streets accepted me the way a system accepts a solved variable, present but no longer influential. At 6:18, I passed a construction site sealed off overnight. Temporary fencing leaned inward, warped as if something heavy had rested against it and then decided to leave. Workers stood nearby drinking coffee, joking quietly, not crossing the boundary even though nothing stopped them. They didn't need barriers anymore. Instinct had taken over. At 7:02, transit resumed full schedule. Trains ran on time. Buses followed routes that had subtly changed, bypassing certain tunnels, certain underpasses. No announcements explained the detours. Riders adjusted without complaint. This is how ecosystems rewrite behavior. Not by force, by pressure. I realized then that the forest had never been the danger. It had been the warning. Out there, patterns were visible because nothing tried to hide them. In cities, patterns dissolve into noise unless you already know how to look. At 8:11, I found myself standing in front of a public library. It was closed. No sign. No explanation. The doors simply wouldn't open. People approached, tested the handles once, then moved on as if remembering an appointment they hadn't meant to forget. Knowledge access restricted without confrontation. Adaptive suppression. I sat on the steps and watched shadows stretch in ways that didn't align with the sun. Not dramatically, just enough to make measuring distance uncomfortable. At 9:30, my phone, dry now inert, buzzed once in my pocket. I didn't take it out. I didn't need to. The message wasn't for me anymore. It was confirmation. By late morning, the pressure had become background radiation. Always there, never sharp. A reminder that space itself had rules now, and they weren't ours. I thought about the first night in the tower, about the way the forest had moved with patience, testing routes, adjusting paths, about how I'd believed documentation was protection. It never is. Documentation is invitation. At 11:47, I passed a park. Children played in the open areas, but the tree line remained untouched. No signs warned people away. No fences blocked access. The avoidance was communal, unconscious. Parents steered strollers along paths that curved just slightly wider than before. Animals watched from cover and did not cross. That boundary wasn't enforced. It was understood. At 13:02, the news finally acknowledged something. A carefully worded segment about environmental recalibration, about how urban development sometimes created unintended interactions with wildlife, about how research teams were monitoring new patterns. The anchor smiled. The audience nodded. No one asked why so many comments were disabled. By mid-afternoon, I knew what my role had become. Not witness, not survivor, archive. I carried continuity, memory of before and after, a reference state preserved long enough to confirm transition success. That was why I'd been spared. Not mercy, utility. At 16:20, I felt it again. Attention, distant now, distributed across the city like a network load. No longer focused, satisfied. At 17:01, a final internal alert crossed the system, though I wasn't supposed to receive it. Migration cycle complete. Niche stabilization achieved. Observation phase concluded. That was it. No escalation notices. No warnings. No finality. Because endings are human constructs. Systems don't end. They equilibrate. As evening approached, I walked toward the outskirts of the city, toward where concrete thinned and vegetation crept back in cautious increments. The forest waited there, unchanged, patient as ever. It hadn't lost. It had expanded its vocabulary. At 1846, 1 minute earlier than the night before, I stopped. The light dimmed, not suddenly, deliberately. I understood then that whatever moved at night no longer needed to migrate visibly. Routes were internal now, underground, structural, behavioral. Human schedules had become part of the terrain. The final realization came quietly, without fear. This wasn't extinction. It was succession. We didn't disappear. We were contextualized, reduced from apex participants to variables managed within a broader system that no longer required our permission to function. I'm writing this because writing is the only act left that hasn't been optimized yet. Words don't produce heat. They don't create waste. They don't alter migration paths unless someone chooses to follow them. If this reaches you and something about your surroundings feels subtly wrong, routes you avoid without reason, places that feel occupied without being crowded, that's not paranoia. That's adaptation. The journal didn't predict the future. It recorded a transition, and transitions don't reverse. They only stop being noticeable once everyone alive has grown up inside them. Tonight, when the city settles and the forest listens, nothing will knock. Nothing will test. Nothing will ask permission, because the system has already learned where everything belongs, including you,